Well, welcome to another Global Christian Perspectives. And this week, we're going to be discussing some of the events in the news and going a little bit more in depth in the second half hour. And for this week, it's going to just be Chris and myself as we're going to try and get a little bit more discussion going on here and a little bit more back and forth than we normally have. So we're going to see how this works for us.
Sure.
So let's get started. Our first topic this week is the 1 year anniversary of Ferguson back in the news. There's been a number of unrest and a number of protests and even some shots fired in the city of Ferguson. And one of the things that I thought we would do is kind of step back and look at race relations. According, I've written the book, What is Wrong with Social Justice? And I see this as a primary example of social justice where it puts the agenda ahead of the truth. And now that the grand jury is out on what actually happened, we know that Michael Brown charged the officer, and the officer was defending himself. Even the Justice Department has looked at that and said there were no charges to be brought against the officer. That it doesn't matter to the activists; they're still protesting as if it was still hands up, don't shoot. So let's start off with asking Chris here: is how much of a problem is race relations in England? I know you have a vastly different history, but when you look at things like this from across the pond, so to speak, how do you view such stories from England?
Well, I think the first thing to say is we do not have this scale of problem. We have a much smaller population of African or West Indian origin. There are some pockets in the country. We have had riots in some of those in the past. There has certainly been a perception that the police target non-white people. I think more accurately, I'd say non-white and non-Chinese people. The Chinese population don't seem to have much of a problem, but anybody with a darker skin than that, there's certainly been a perception that they are picked on by the police, and the police have historically not been terribly representative of particularly the black minority in the country. We have some policies in place now which are distinctly going in the direction of affirmative action to get a more balanced mix of officers, particularly in those areas where we have significant minority populations, and try to make the police force more accurately represent the people that they're policing. The dangers of having the police of one colour and most of the people of another are just obvious, I think. I'd say that that's a problem in Ferguson, which I understand has a wholly white police department and nearly 70% black population. But I take your point about the autopsy report on Michael Brown. It does appear that the idiot was charging an armed police officer. I'd be running very fast in the opposite direction in his situation, but there we go. But you mentioned the statistics. As I understand it, the initial phase of the Michael Brown episode was that the policeman pulled up to him in a car, and Brown attempted to get hold of his gun. And I'm thinking at that point, well, what is an ordinary beat copper doing with a gun in the first place to have it taken off him? Because, of course, by and large, our police are not armed. Had the officer not been armed, maybe the whole thing wouldn't have happened. And I look at your statistics and you're saying 400 people shot by police. Here there have been round about 70 deaths by police action since 1920. That's very nearly 100 years. I don't know if there's a fundamental difference, but personally, I do not think injecting firearms into these situations helps at all, and I think it massively contributes to the number of deaths.
Might very well true, but then the history of America, particularly with the frontiers in the West, guns are, as you might put it, that ship has sailed. We can have an issue on guns at some point, but considering the number of people hunting, the fact that officers in this country, I mean, when your Bobbies first started, what was the beginning of the 19th century?
Yes. Yeah,
that they didn't have guns, and so they basically became a force without guns, and have always been that way, and they have been moving towards, not very much, but carrying guns. Whereas in the United States, lawmen have always carried guns. It's just been a factor. So whatever the results there, I don't think we're going to be very successful in changing whether police carry guns, particularly at this point, considering so many criminals are armed as well. But yeah, in terms of statistics, we have something around the lines of 40 million encounters, police-citizen encounters each year in this country, of which about 400 end up in death. And some of those are, for example, when they had the shootout with the two Boston terrorists, that was counted in it. When they have shootout with police, it also accounts for a whole other things. On the other hand, we have roughly 100 police officers, 120 police officers every year who are killed in the line of duty. Yeah. Sometimes they do have people attack them, take their own gun, as I have in one of my blogs. I have the account of, I think his name is Smith, a police officer who just a few months before Ferguson, which I think is probably significant because the police community is a small enough community. They're very likely to hear about these things where the general public want it. But he went to a domestic dispute, and in the middle of a domestic dispute, an unarmed man, as he pulled up, attacked him while he was still in his car, grabbed his gun and shot him, and he died. So, you're actually, in terms of who's at risk, the police officer statistically is far more likely to die in an encounter than an average citizen or even a black citizen. So I think those are factors we have to take into account, which is why when I put it in terms of social justice, truth is so important when you look at these things. When a Brown, Ferguson, in fact, when all these things start out, I say, let's hold off until we know what happened. Then we make our judgment. In North Carolina, police officer looks very clearly to have been in the wrong. And he's currently under trial for murder. Michael Brown, to me, the real victim is the police officer whose life has been turned upside down and ruined. He's had to leave the force and is essentially living in hiding now.
My real difficulty is that there seems to be a level of distrust between the police and the population which eclipses any other consideration there. And you may see it differently in the States than I do, but I do not think that you can police without consent at the end of the day. If you've got a wholly recalcitrant population, you can't police it you can only hold it down with arming, and even then, not necessarily with huge success. I don't know what can be done, but I think that there has to be some way of bringing the sides together so that they don't. I read a lot from the States, and it seems to me that there are two tribes there which are basically throwing verbal brickbats at each other, and there's no meeting of minds, and that's really worrying to me.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you there. I think, you know, things like community policing and getting police officers out of there. I think part of the problem is being a police officer has become so expensive to the city that they have very few of them, and then they tend to, they become a very expensive resource to have with all the, you know, pensions and costs and all that. So they tend to have very few of them, and they parcel them out. And one of the things that happen is, they start putting them in police cars instead of being in the community, known by the community. They go in cars and drive through, which is, and there's been sort of a move back to community policing. I think on the other hand, there's a problem within the Black community that, to be upstanding, go to school, blah, those sort of things are considered being white, and it's frowned upon. And there's a group, I would say, led by people like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, who literally make their living on keeping division between the races. If there was no division between the races, there would be no need for a Jesse Jackson or an Al Sharpton. And if you walk around, just the human nature, if you walk around, you buy a new car, right? First thing you see is you start seeing cars all over the place that are just what you just bought. You'd never know to look at it before, but now you're focused on it and you see it.
Yes.
And it's not that everybody just went out and bought the same car you did. It's just a thing. And if you start thinking, but give me an example. Let's say you have a young man who gets pulled over 10 times in 1 year by police, right? If he's Black, what's he going to think?
He's being picked on. Yeah.
Okay, so you think he's being picked on. By the way, that was me. I got pulled over 10 times in 1 year. Now I happened to be driving a 71 Mustang, and I was, a 22-year-old, and but was it, what was it? Why was I getting pulled over? I got pulled over. I didn't get pulled over even though I was still young and had a Mustang. I didn't get pulled over as much the following year or the year before that. But that particular year, it's just, there's going to be things that happen in terms of statistics. And now if you're told the police are out to get you, you're Black, they're going to focus on you, and then you get pulled over, what's the first thing you think? Right? Yeah. And I don't say that's by any means the entire problem. I think there's another part of the problem is statistically, you look at where crime is in the neighborhoods where Black minorities live, but it's a very, very complex issue. And I come back to, this is where truth is so important. Let's make sure we get the facts right, then look at what we need to do.
I have no good solutions. I just see a problem and worry about it. And I worry about a divided community more than perhaps any other aspect of it.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I don't see, I think there's, as in so many changes, I don't think it's going to so much be a policy of, putting in community policing or this or that. I think it's going to be, people have to change their perspective. People have to, and that's really tough.
Indeed, so.
Well, having not solved one issue, let's go on to another issue that we can't solve.
Yes.
And this is illegal immigration. This is an issue that's very much an issue in the United States. It was recently raised. It's been raised by a number of people. I know Ann Coulter has recently written a book on it. But Donald Trump, being Trump, was able to exalt it up into media status. But it's been festering for a long time. It's also one of the one of the things that's happening in this election cycle on both sides, I believe, is that people are very frustrated with their politicians in Washington. They're not paying attention to them. The left wants people like Obama and the Congress to be more left. The right wants the Congress and the Senate to be more right. And it's just causing a lot of frustrations. And for the right, one of the big issues is, not by any means the only, but the big issue is immigration. What do we do? How do we deal with it? Is immigration an issue at all in the UK?
Massive issue. We're in a slightly different situation in that this is a fairly crowded island. We have about a fifth of the US population in an area around the size of one of your middling states, and quite a lot of it is mountain. So we are fairly full. We're not self-supporting agriculturally as it is. There's a permanent housing shortage, and there is a general feeling that we do not want lots more immigration because we cannot actually cope with it. We can't generate the jobs for people at a fast enough rate. One little factor that came to my attention earlier this week was that in the last year we have 250,000 more people from the rest of the European Union here, and 250,000 in 1 year is a very significant slice. That's just the European Union. We cannot stop European Union workers who have jobs coming here, because that's part of the free movement of capital goods and labour that we signed up to in the first place. But then Europe has a major problem itself. That was highlighted by a news item on the television earlier this evening. One of the Greek islands, Kos, is about 6 miles by water from Turkey, and it's got, I think at the last count, something like 10,000 Syrian refugees landed on it. I think the normal population is about 2,000. So there's a major problem there. There are permanent stories about boatloads of people coming across the Mediterranean, generally from Libya, and landing in southern Italy. So you've got boats from the east coming to Greece, boats from the south coming to Italy and also to Spain, and you'll be talking probably well over 1 million by the end of this year, just in this year. They're not all asylum seekers. A lot of them, particularly from Africa, are economic migrants who see a better future in Europe. Europe as a whole is somewhat less crowded than the UK, but there are limits, and it's feeling more like an invasion than a migration to a lot of people. So yes, it is a very large issue, and I have at war the Christian side, which says I should be welcoming the stranger, particularly when they're in distress. and offering hospitality and succor to them, against there is just an unending stream at the moment and no good way of stopping it. Of course, we have the luxury of being an island nation. There is one point of, in fact, rail contact in the form of the tunnel, the Channel Tunnel. At the French end, that's under siege by several thousand migrants trying to illegally hop on trains, and they keep having to be moved off trains and lorries, and those searched on the way through. A fair number get through. The sea crossing's 20 some miles. There are going to be some boats that get across as well. Yes, we have a problem there.
Well, it seems like, by the way, I want to mention to the audience, I do have the question app up and running. So if you have any questions, feel free to submit them. It does seem to have a problem. Of course, we have the long borders here. But what is our, let's talk as Christians, what is our obligation? I tend to look at this in terms of, I as a husband have a duty to my family. I have a duty to my community. I have a duty to my state. I have a duty to my country, and I have a duty to the world. And so I do believe that there is a duty there, but how do I believe it's important that I balance out. And for example, one of the stats I saw recently here is that in the last 6 years, the economy has been so bad that all the new jobs created have basically equaled the number of immigrants coming into the country. And so there's been no new jobs for Americans who are already here. And I think, can we just say we have an obligation to others and just let them come in without saying we have an obligation to those who are already here? Or how do we balance out these competing needs?
Hugely difficult. I mean, I go back to you love your neighbor as yourself, and it's reasonably obvious from examples in the New Testament that your neighbor has to include those people who are very much unlike you and whom you have traditionally hated for being different, in the form of the parable of the Good Samaritan. There's the story of the Syrophoenician woman at the well, who actually seems to give Jesus a little education in tolerating the stranger, that being a successor to the Canaanites, who were also not exactly the best friends of the Israelites. But you can go back to the Old Testament, and there are provisions saying that you should welcome the stranger within your country and you should treat them well. Treat them well, yes. Feed them, I suspect probably. But when it's a case of housing them, clothing them, finding them jobs, it's a task which I think is beyond us at the moment. And we also, over the last few years, have had more immigrants than we have created new jobs. So we have exactly the same problem as you have there. There has to be a balance. I personally don't think that the UK takes enough asylum seekers who are in genuine distress. We do return quite a few to their countries of origin in circumstances where they are in serious danger. For instance, we've recently been returning quite a few to Afghanistan, which I would not describe as a safe place. I don't think we should be doing that. I think we should be more hospitable than that. But I do think we need to have some regard to what we can actually do.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And one of the frustrating things from at least from the American perspective, is I think this is actually a fairly easy issue to solve in America. The solution is pretty much agreed to by 60 to 70% of the people. We would build a wall across, or the equivalent of a wall across the southern border, close off the illegal immigration that's there. I mean, for example, one of my big issues there is we let illegal immigrations in, but then you look at people, is it fair to the person who's waiting legally to come in, that they can't come in? And then what do you do with the people who are here? I actually think it's pretty easy to deal with those. You come up with some sort of system that would allow for at least legalization. In other words, they would be here legally. If they wanted to become citizens, then they would have to go maybe a much more complicated, or maybe because they broke the law, they can never become citizens. But I'm confident that we could solve that problem fairly easily once the wall was put up. I mean, the big problem here is that, we've been here before. 1980s, we had an illegal immigration problem of 4 million. We essentially said, we're going to close the border, we're going to give amnesty to those who are here, and then that'll be problem solved. We gave amnesty to everybody here, but we left the border open, and now we've got anywhere from 11 to 30 million illegal aliens here. And people are saying, well, let's do it again. It's sort of like, well, you fooled me once, shame on me, fool me twice. Yeah, so I also, one closing comment, then we'll move on. I think that the illegal immigration problem is also a problem of foreign policy. That we should, our foreign, at least a component of our foreign policy should be looking at these countries where people are trying to come into and saying, what can we do in those countries so the people aren't trying to flee them? Is there economic development? There's something we can do more intelligently than we have been doing to make sure that their home countries are something that they don't necessarily want to flee from.
I agree with that. Clearly, one of the big problems with immigration to Europe at the moment is Syria, and it's a bit difficult to do anything about Syria for a large number of reasons. And Libya is also in a state of meltdown at the moment, which is where a lot of the migrants from the south are coming from. If nothing else, setting up bases of ours in the countries from which they are generally coming to attract people to make legal applications rather than entering illegally might be a first start. I don't want to refuse them all. The numbers are ridiculous. I don't like them entering illegally, because you don't then know who you've got in the country to start off with. Yeah, I think you're a lot along the right lines. But Libya and Syria are problems which I don't think you can solve with foreign aid, unfortunately.
No, I agree with you, and I think we may very well disagree on what we should do there. I'm actually not sure what to do. To me, those are both classic problems of too little, too late, and now there are no good options of what to do. But that's probably a discussion for another week. We're at the bottom of the hour, and at this time, we take a quick transition before we go into our in-depth topic. And this week, our in-depth topic is going to be on good and evil, or at least a phrase of it. But before we do that, again, I'm Elgin Hushbeck, and I've written a number of books. What is Wrong with Social Justice? Preserving Democracy are my two political books, and I've written a couple on Christian apologetics, Evidence for the Bible, and Christianity and Secularism. And you can reach me at hushbeck.com. So, Chris, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm one of the editors with Energian. No books to my name as yet, but my blog is airlines, E-Y-R-E, lines.energian.net, which tends to get a new blog post every week or so. That's me.
Okay, well, let's go into our second half of our show today, and this one we're going to talk, like I said, a little bit about good and evil. But one of the sites that I regularly visit and watch is Prager University, and they put on usually a 5-minute video once a week about some sort of topic. And 2 weeks ago, for example, this week's topic is was slavery the cause of the Civil War? But last week's topic was on the Iran deal. Well, my point here is not really the Iran deal. In making the video, Des Prager, who actually did that particular one, he normally doesn't do them, but this one he did, and he made a point about the metaphor of evil. And oftentimes, particularly in the Bible even, we have this metaphor of evil as being dark and sinister and good being light. And he turned that on its head and said his point was that evil is actually extremely bright. It's so bright that we don't even want to look at it. And therefore, we turn our heads away and we don't see it. And that struck me as I particularly like people who turn things on their heads and make you think a different way. And that did. And it just sort of caught me as this is something that we have been, at least for me, seeing a lot. We, particularly in the West, we don't face a lot of real evil in the West. Particularly not, that they do with ISIS in the Middle East or Boko Haram, kidnapping hundreds of girls and selling them into sex slavery that they have in Africa. I mean, we have a lot of problems in the West, but thankfully we don't have those problems, at least not yet. And so we don't really see evil in the same sense. And therefore we tend to, when we do see it, it's very easy for us to turn our head away and ignore it. And thus I find it very interesting. You look at the uproar around the killing of Cecil the Lion and the non-uproar around the hundreds of thousands of people killed in Syria, for example. It's easy to get upset about Cecil the Lion. It's safe to get upset about Cecil the Lion. It's not quite as safe to get upset about what's happening in Syria, because we were just talking a minute ago. There aren't really any good options there. And then what do we actually have to do if we don't have any good options? And quite frankly, it is easier just to ignore it. So that's kind of the launching off point for where we're going to take this discussion is how do we deal with the whole concepts of in particular, evil. We in the West like to talk about God is love. We just love everybody.
We do.
And let's just forget that evil stuff. But it's still out there. How do we address that, Chris?
One strong argument would be that the way to tackle evil is with love, and that eventually love is going to conquer evil. You just need more of it and more persistence with it. And in certain circumstances, that might work. I was interested in Prager's suggestion that that evil could be considered as blindingly bright so that you couldn't look at it. I tend not to see it that way. I mean, perhaps another turn of phrase would be the elephant in the room that nobody talks about. Certainly, things that you feel that you cannot possibly do anything about may be abundantly obvious to you, but you stop talking about them because there's nothing that can be done. Or at least you think there's nothing that can be done. That is a concern. I don't think you should ever give up and think there is nothing that I can do about this. There may be very, very little you can do, but how can you do something? and we don't
Let
all.
me jump in there real quick and ask you a question on that point. You say there's nothing can be done, and I on the one hand, I kind of agree with you, but then I think, okay, Boko Haram. Let's just take that. That's a small group, currently small group in Africa, best known for atrocities of killing Christians and kidnapping girls and selling them into sex slavery. Just as a pure hypothetical, not asking do we, but could we, with what we have in terms of the might of the United States, or even better, the combined might of Europe and the United States, could we take care of Boko Haram? I tend to think we could. But
I think we could, but could we simultaneously take care of all the other vaguely similar happenings that are occurring all the way around the world? And would we want to stay there long enough to make sure that it doesn't recur? Because the sort of quick in and out, solve the problem and go away, frankly, doesn't seem to have been working terribly brilliantly over the last 20 to 30 years, maybe longer.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that point. And that's the key. I mean, for example, one of the things I've made before is the argument of the pattern of Korea versus Vietnam. Mm-hmm. Korea, we went in as the United Nations went in, stopped the war, settled a kind of peace, although technically there's never been a peace treaty. But we stayed. There are troops, U.S. troops today in Korea, and Korea is a first world thriving economy. South Korea is a first world thriving economy and kind of a jewel of the Middle East, the Far East. Vietnam, we went in, we got another peace treaty, actually got a signed peace treaty, but we left, cut off all aid to the South, and it fell, and millions of people died as a result. So you look at Iraq now, we went in, we stabilized the country. No guarantees it would have continued on, but it pretty much guaranteed that when we pulled out, it would fall apart, and which is what it's doing right now. So I agree. If we go in, we would have to go in on a more permanent basis. And this sort of brings up, at least from an American perspective, this brings up the whole question of, are we the policemen of the world? Which is a question, I think, that even though we are, as America is the world's superpower, and like it or not, we kind of are the policemen of the world, do we really want that role, and do we really accept that role, and where do we draw the lines, the hard part?
There's another wrinkle on that, actually, because I don't know how much you've looked at the history of the British Empire, which it is popular to decry as a terrible imperialist, colonialist thing.
I've actually looked quite a bit.
Okay, but by and large, what happened was we wanted to go and establish a trading post. We wanted to get some trade going with somewhere, and found after a while that we had to take some land, and then we had to take some more land, and eventually we had to take the country. Now, our example is that sometime in the early 20th century, it became just too expensive to maintain all of this. I might suspect that with similar ideas in mind, the states could fall into exactly the same trap we did there. I
think you're right on that point.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I remember interesting. It's kind of fascinating reading through the biography of Churchill about a year or two ago, and you look at his comments on India, and of course he was now routinely declared to be wrong on India, and yet when you dig down deep and you look at the reasons for his comments, that if the British pulled out, there would be massive unrest and millions of deaths, he was actually right.
Yes.
So and I think that comes to the nub of the question. If we went around and we became the policemen of the world and we pacified everything, it would be better. Except, would we would we be able? Could we do that and still be the people we want to be? And at what point it becomes a whole big mess that there again, it's one of these issues. There's no easy answers.
I think we're back to the Ferguson point. Nobody likes the police if they're a different set of people from us, and I think the States would suffer from that. I think the States is suffering from that, in terms of a fairly widespread attitude in the Middle East. There has been intervention in the past. It's not particularly been appreciated. In one way, I am very glad to see that the States has come to the fore in this, because before the States was the great Satan, we were. Because we had done exactly the same thing previously. I don't like the concept of meddling too much in other countries' affairs unless we are actually prepared to go and conquer it and stay there and pacify it in the process, or know somebody who can do the staying and pacifying after us. And by and large, I don't think there are any good candidates. I don't think the States can afford to do it everywhere that it would like to. I think your military budget is probably a lot larger than is good for your national economy at the moment. It might not be too much when compared with national security, but I don't think it's good for your economy.
Well, I would agree with you there, actually, on both points. The best for the economy, the best defense budget is zero, because then you're free to devote your money elsewhere. On the other hand, it's one of the worst budget, because if you don't protect the country, I think actually, in terms of my reading of history, one of the real advantages that I think gets taken for granted is that if you look at the last several hundred years of history, you see that the international globe was basically governed by Great Britain, whose primary focus was freedom of the seas and trade.
Yeah.
And then that was taken over by the United States, whose primary goal is freedom of the seas and trade. And so we've kind of gotten used to, this is the way it is, how could it be different? And I know what's happening is we're pulling back worldwide, the United States is, because of, in terms of just a little tidbit here, internal budget reviews, we have a bipartisan panel that looks at what we need to fulfill our defense commitments. And for example, in the Navy, our current defense commitments requires 341 ship Navy. We are currently at 278, and we're scheduled to go down much lower. We have the Ohio class submarines that are getting, they cannot, because of the nuclear engines, you cannot use them much longer. And we have no replacement in the pipelines for them. We're basically cannibalized. We cannibalized our military in the 1990s, what was then called effectively the peace dividend. And that was reversed after 9/11, but we're cannibalizing it again. And I think we're seeing that with the excursion of China into the South China Seas, Russia going into the Crimea. Just around the world, we see people taking advantage of the fact that the United States has been pulling back. And, so again, we come back to the problem of power vacuum. But, actually, I think we're kind of getting off the point here with international trade and power vacuums and stuff, thinking about it.
I think we probably are, yes.
Wouldn't be the first time.
Combating evil, generally.
Going back to, again, it's you know what? It's probably part of the same factor. It's very easy not to talk about evil because we can divert it. And I guess even in this conversation, we found ourselves, let's get away from that evil stuff and let's get back to the safer stuff like international diplomacy and things like that. So how do we confront evil? And I'm not saying, for example, have you watched ISIS is famous for putting out these videos about new and innovative ways on killing people with high definition cameras and stuff. Have you watched those videos?
I've watched a couple. I don't particularly want to watch any more of them. I don't particularly like horror films, so it doesn't sort of attract that side. They are attempting to project terror, and by and large, I think they're succeeding in projecting terror. If you look at the way in which they initially seized territory in Iraq and Syria, basically the opposition folded because, by and large, they were so scared of what would happen to them if they didn't. And this is a very long-standing technique which has been used for a long time in warfare. The English were using it when we were fighting the French in the 100 Years' War, for instance. And that was by no means the origin of it. And it is an evil. But it is also a valid technique in terms of war. If you can terrify the enemy enough, you actually save lives because they surrender. I don't approve of it, but then I don't actually approve of war very much. I think the idea of just war in Christianity was probably a mistake, and I can't actually identify very many wars since the theory was formulated in the 4th century, which meet the description of a just war anyhow. So I'm not quite with the Anabaptist tradition or the Quaker tradition of complete pacifism, but the older I get, the nearer I'm getting to feeling that that is the way Christians should be reacting to things. So
where would you put World War II in that?
I think that had to be fought because Hitler was just so unpleasant. But having said that, the same logic would dictate that we should then have invaded Russia and got rid of Joe Stalin because he was just as nasty. And that was something that we couldn't do. I mean, my main feeling on World War II is that it was a continuation of World War I because we messed up the Peace of Versailles and were far too hard on Germany in the process.
Yeah. I actually read a book on World War I recently, and they were commenting on they did a series of mini biographies in the middle of it. And one of them they did on Pershing, and something I hadn't heard of before is Pershing predicted there would be World War II because we weren't hard enough. He was arguing that rather than just signing a peace and be done with it, that you had to go into Germany and actually defeat the Germans, because the Germans had not been, they had been defeated on the battlefield, but the country hadn't been defeated. By the way, I'm not saying I agree with this view, but I do know there's a particular view within military history that going all the way back to the Peloponnesian War, that peace is oftentimes, if you don't actually settle the fundamental issues, peace is really just a cessation of war before it starts again.
Yes.
In the Peloponnesian War, which is, it's 31 years long, but in the middle of that, they had a peace. And for about 4 years, they didn't fight. And there's kind of this debate as to whether the Peloponnesian War is one war or two wars. And generally it's considered one war, and the peace wasn't really a real peace because it actually didn't settle the issues. World War I, didn't settle the issues. World War II certainly did, and we don't have an issue with Japan or Germany any longer. So I mean, confronting evil is very, very tough. For example, I am firmly convinced that had Europe, had particularly France and Germany, confronted Hitler sooner, had they been more willing to go to war, for example, when he reoccupied the Rhineland, that there would never have been a World War II. At least, though there may still been one in the Pacific with the Japanese, but you wouldn't have had Hitler in Europe. So, but again, 2020 hindsight is always perfect. So, or pretends to be perfect.
How about, well, I suppose I should say that, how about the evils of, for instance, the oppression of minorities, which we occasionally are blind to? I know that life looks very different from the point of view of somebody from a minority of various kinds here. Having spent quite some time with people from those communities, we do minor acts of oppression quite a lot of the time, and they are also an evil, although they are relative to lopping people's heads off in Syria. They are smaller acts of evil. What's your feeling on that?
Can you give me an example?
I have in mind the reaction which openly gay people still get in some areas in this country. If you have a same-sex couple walking down the street hand in hand, for instance, they are going to get jeered at, and they may get threatened in some places. And we have gay marriage as a universal thing, and there was very little fuss about it here. But in the smaller way, people will shy away from them and not feel entirely comfortable with them, and won't strike up a conversation with them, which is all a form of ostracism, a form of shunning, and to my mind it is a small evil. I try to go out of my way to notice when that is happening and correct it in myself, but I'm sure I still do it because I'm oblivious to some of the ways in which I am downvaluing people.
Would you include someone in there who read the Bible and believed that same-sex, homosexuality was a sin? Would you include them in that as the category evil, and how would you counsel them to deal with someone who was homosexual and the fact that they were a sin? I, by the way, would put myself in that category. I believe homosexuality is a sin. I believe, on the other hand, that we should be compassionate. That doesn't make them some sort of alien human being. We're all sinners. One of the things is that I remember going back even into a young kid in the 60s and the 70s, there was no inkling that homosexuality was still by the culture bad. Mm-hmm. But I was somewhat troubled by the idea that this is a sin. Aren't all sins sins? And what makes that person's sin so much worse than the sins that I'm struggling with?
True enough. As far as those who on principle feel that homosexuality is a sin, I cannot criticize their decision to read scripture that way, because I used to. I have rethought the scriptures, and I believe there is a stronger priority, and that is the love of neighbour. And also, it is not mine to judge; it is God's to judge. So I will not go about doing it. So I have friends here who think exactly as you do. I disapprove only when they allow that to be carried forward into action, and they discriminate actively against people who are gay. I can't really point fingers when they just avoid being near people who are gay, because they probably don't notice. I may on occasion draw their attention to the fact that they are walking to the other side of the room and things of that sort, but nothing more than that. I understand the attitude. I respect the views of people drawn from scripture. I think they're wrong, but there we are.
Yeah, I'd actually say in the States, for example, the proponents of same-sex marriage are much more intolerant than the opponents of it, barring a few, unfortunately, very noticeable examples, such as, I mean, for example, in the whole same-sex marriage debate, the most despicable people of all, in my view, are the people from the Westboro Baptist Church, or the ones who go down and protest at funerals and stuff. I mean, that to me is evil. I have no, that's almost enough to make me change my position on homosexuality. But on the other hand, I see the same-sex marriage supporters. We had the guy who's the head of Firefox was fired from his job because 7 years in the past he had given money to a campaign in California to support traditional marriage. You have the baker up in Washington State here who, the florist in Washington State, had a gay patron, knew he was gay, sold flowers to them all the time, very friendly relationship. The guy came in and said, I want you to make flowers for my wedding. And she said, no, because of my beliefs, I don't want to participate in your wedding. I don't want to, and so she said, offered to recommend some very good florists who would do an excellent job for him. She is on threat of now losing her business and her house because of the state going after her for that. Yeah. To me, that's intolerant. I think it's a problem. Tolerance is a problem on both sides. Well, go ahead and close up. We're about time here. Let me give the final words to you.
I think the easiest thing for me to say is that contemplating Westboro Baptist Church is probably the greatest challenge to my own tolerance that could possibly be mentioned. I would like to think that I could join them in fellowship, but I would have a very, very hard time of
it. Okay, well, let me go back a slight bit and add one little bit to that. I think fondly of the fact that when you look at the New Testament, the only people Jesus was really, really critical of was the religious people. And I tend to kind of put Westboro Baptist Church in that category.
I wouldn't argue too much.
Well, on that note of agreement, we're going to go ahead and close. We want to thank everybody for joining this week. Hopefully this has been an interesting and free-flowing discussion. I know we kind of went in a lot of places, and let us know if you like that better than having lots more guests and not being able to quite go as many places. But anyway, I want to thank you for joining us. Be sure to check out Google Hangouts for Nergion throughout the week. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next week on Global Christians Perspective. Thanks for joining us.